to grab your little drink umbrella because today you're hanging out at the card pool. I'm your host, Kyle Robertson.
And I'm Stu Galetta.
And today we're going to look at our top 10 hidden gems of the set Tempest.
This is part one of our two-part set review. Our second is going to be about the top 10 money cards from Tempest. But without further ado, let's start the review.
For my number 10, I have a rather complex and slightly confusing card called Magnetic Web, but I'll try to explain it here. It's an artifact. It costs 2 to play. If any creature with magnet counters on it attacks, all creatures with magnet counters on them that the same attacking player controls also attack if they are able. Also, conversely, if any creature with any magnet counters on it attacks, all creatures with magnet counters on them that the defending player controls will have to block that creature, if able. Finally, you can tap 1 mana and tap Magnetic Web to put a magnet counter on target creature. I chose this card because there are actually quite a few cards in Tempest, and I think we might talk about them a little bit later on, that kind of focus on this idea of all of your creatures, or at least some select of somebody's creatures, have to attack or have to block, and if they do or if they don't, depending, there's some kind of punishment for it. I thought Magnetic Web was the most interesting of all of these cards, not only from a flavor standpoint, because, you know, magnets attract, opposites attract, that whole thing with everybody with magnets going together on something. I also thought this was the most useful in that, compared to some of the other options we see that were mostly creatures, I believe, this is a non-creature artifact, and in that sense, it's slightly more difficult to interact with or remove than some of the other options. I know that this card can read slightly complicated on the face of it, so basically what it amounts to is, while it may be a bit slow to get going, slowly tapping and putting magnet counters on things, it makes combat very complicated very quickly, to the point where people will be dreading the idea of attacking at all, because then if they are the ones attacking or getting attacked, all their creatures with magnet counters are going to get looped into it somehow, and it just makes combat scenarios a nightmare for people, which could lead them to not attacking, or you could tailor it to best suit your needs and make it advantageous to you whatever way things come out. I could say a lot more about this card, but I think I will leave it up to your interpretation and imagination. I just wanted to point this thing out because of the nutty possibilities that it gives, and I just thought it was super cool.
Good job deciphering this. This is a wall of text. And for anyone who's out there trying to get their head around this still, definitely look up the Oracle text on this. But I would love to see this card in a Target Matters deck. Willbreaker is a phenomenal blue card that can just be so oppressive. And for 1 mana, being able to just, hey, tap this, target a creature, and gain control of it is really, really powerful. And we see effects that are very similar to Magnetic Web in red, where it's trying to make people attack during combat because they have to. It's initiating some form of attacking at some form of player. And the really cool thing about this is you can target your opponent's creatures, and you don't even have to target yours at all. So, opponent A now has one, opponent B now has one, and they have to start figuring out how this works because, they can't attack as easily as they would have before. A little niche, but you could definitely see this working in a lot of decks.
I also think that while it may be, as I said, a bit slow to get going, I mean, if you're playing a lot of artifacts, there are a lot of ways around this. Unwinding Clock and Clock of Omens, just off the top of my head, there are tons more. So there are ways to abuse the tapping and untapping so that you can put multiple magnet counters on there in the same turn. Sadly, Proliferate doesn't work with this because you can't put new magnet counters on other things, and having multiple counters doesn't really mean anything. But still, this is just a really fun card to play around with if you can kind of wrap your brain around the possibilities.
Going away from colorless into all the colors, I couldn't decide on just one, so I wanted to talk about all of them. At my number 10 slot, we're talking about the Licids. Now, there's one in each color, and they all have a variety of effects. Now, they all cost 2 mana, meaning so 1 generic and whatever color it is. And they all have an effect for 2 mana or 1 mana, being that this creature can now tap and become an aura and equip onto a creature and enable some effect. So if we look at the green one, which is called Nurturing Licid, like I said, it costs 2 mana, it's a colorless and a green, and it has the effect for 1 green mana, you can tap it and it becomes an enchantment on a creature. And the enchantment then reads, for 1 green mana, regenerate enchanted creature. And you can keep this on there for as long as you want, but it also has the other effect of unequipping for 1 green mana at instant speed, which is really, really powerful. So, alright, crazy combat's going in, you're swinging in, trying to go big with your commander. They do some sort of crazy combat tricks to try to kill your guy. So for 1 mana, you could tap this guy, equip him onto your commander, and pay an additional 1 green to regenerate it. So it'll take it out of combat, but the main point being is that it will survive. So this way you don't have to worry about the commander tax, it stays on the field, and you get a little bit more value. But also, if you need this guy to be a creature again, or you need to equip it onto a different creature, you can pay 1 green mana instant speed, and it's now back on the field as is. There's a lot of enchantments that do similar things to this, but for me personally, I've never really been a fan of them because they're just one-time uses. Now, this being a creature is recurable just for the fact that it is a creature, and you get this additional effect. So it's not just a dead aura in your hand, it's a creature that can be out in the field, can be recurred, and can be utilized for bigger creatures to make them more impactful. This style of creature is just incredible. It just blew my mind to see something this bizarre in Magic itself.
Yeah, the Lycids are something that was experimented with once and then never really became a thing again. I think probably for complexity reasons. And honestly, I feel the same way about these that I feel about Magnetic Web, in that we could spend like an entire episode just discussing the various different applications of these cards, which I'm not going to do. I'm just going to say these are a really cool find as well, Stu. I'm glad you decided to talk about them because I'm not really sure what deck type these lend themselves to, but I guess that's kind of the point. They could go in almost any deck. They are pretty interesting tech options, although I think some of them, such as the green one and the white one, are stronger than others, like the black one and the blue one. But that's just my personal taste. Other people might like them too. Honestly, these are just really, really cool, and while I think we probably should move on from talking about them, I think they're great, honestly. I think these are really, really fun, and I'm sorry to say they haven't done more of these Lycids since then.
Like with the white one giving first strike, that is a strong effect that you would want on a creature. The red one giving haste, that's also a really good one. And the green, regeneration. It's not like it's just some sort of lame effect where it just beats them. It gives them like an actual power.
It's definitely, definitely interesting for sure, and I guess kind of our theme here is just offbeat stuff, because going to the number 9 on my list, I'm going to go with a green card, and it's called Nature's Revolt. It does another thing that you don't generally see in Magic. It is an enchantment that costs 5 to play, 3 and double green, and it simply makes all of your lands into 2/2 creatures. Now, I know everybody is going to start screaming about this card the second I brought it up, because you can't do that. Lands being creatures are dangerous. Yeah, that is true. I mean, you play this card, and if you aren't careful and you don't have adequate protection, one board wipe is going to wipe out all of your lands and all of your creatures and leave you sorta helpless, really. But I wanted to name this card just because I find these kind of cards that make lands into creatures really cool and interesting, and also potential game enders if they are played carefully and played at the right time, because in a typical game of Magic, especially Commander, these games go on forever. You have tons of lands out there, and I would argue that a lot of them, if not most of them, are things like basic lands that don't really do a whole lot besides give you mana. If you play a card like Nature's Revolt at the right time toward the end of the game when your opponent is not expecting it, you will suddenly be smacking them in the face with anywhere from like 10 to 20 2/2 creatures that suddenly came out of nowhere and can attack on the same turn that you played this. These kind of cards are inherently dangerous. You have to be very, very careful about when you play them and how, but there are things to minimize the danger. Terra Eternal, for example, making all lands indestructible, springs to mind. Decks like Titania also love this because it minimizes the negative impact of your lands potentially getting destroyed. All in all, definitely not for every deck, but definitely interesting and something to consider and think about at the same time.
Like, if you are a deck that needs to swing out and swing big, but you become vulnerable afterwards, this protects you on this. Like, if your creatures aren't vigilant, they're all tapped, and you can't block. Well, if you have 5 mana, you've made everyone's lands into creatures. But now, since everyone's lands are creatures, no one wants to board wipe unless they can destroy this enchantment or protect their lands. So you're saying, hey, I'm willing to throw the game just as crazy as I'm going to throw it. but you have to be willing to pay the cost and the consequence. Because if somebody board wipes that isn't you, everyone's going to hate that player, and everyone's going to go to that guy, even though you played this enchantment. So it's an effect you do see here and there throughout Magic, but it's definitely high risk and high reward. Now from going to green to red, let's go into my number 9 of No Quarter. Now this is a 4-drop enchantment, 3 colorless and a red. Whenever any creature blocks or is blocked by a creature with lesser power, destroy that creature with lesser power. So it's a pretty clean and cut enchantment. Now the reason I like this card so much is not to be played in red, but to be played in a deck that utilizes red. So for example, if you look at a green-red deck, most of them are really giant beefy beasts or creatures that are like costing anywhere from 4 to like 7 mana. They have huge stats, huge effects, most of the time trample, and they're really powerful once they hit the board. But the problem that those creatures always face is that they're easily chump blockable if they don't have trample. So it doesn't matter if you have this big guy out, if he can't hit, he's not doing anything. But also another thing is there's always a lot of little creatures, and black does this the most, in which they are these little tiny guys and they have death touch. If you paid 7 mana for a creature and they paid 1 mana for a guy who can easily trade out with you, you didn't gain anything. In fact, actually, you're in a worse position because you have a higher thing to lose. Now, this card here makes it so it gets around those scenarios, meaning it's so that their creatures will die and your creature will live. And it makes it so this is for everyone. So if anyone's trying to do any little token builds or just run a small army, they can no longer be safe. And this is a great enchantment for that.
Yeah, many a Magic player will tell you that they've had their days ruined by them having a gigantic creature that can kill somebody in one hit, only for said defending player to play something like Baleful Strix or Typhoid Rats, a little tiny death touch blocker that can both chump block and kill the much larger attacking creature. No Quarter deals with that situation quite nicely. And I should also note that this card also plays very well with Trample, because usually if a creature with Trample attacks and gets chump blocked, sure, they're still going to take a bunch of damage, but not quite as much as you would like, probably. With No Quarter, it automatically destroys the littler creature that is blocking, and in those situations when you have a creature with Trample, all the damage will go through as though it weren't even blocked at all. So they're going to be taking the full brunt of the attack, and as we've both said earlier, getting around those small utility creatures, especially ones that maybe can't take combat damage but can be destroyed by other means, is just really good. Well, I'm going to move to my number 8 now with something pretty simple in comparison to the things we've been talking about already. It is another enchantment called Field of Souls. This is a white card. It costs 4 to play, 2 colorless, and double white. And whenever a non-token creature is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you put an Essence token into play, and an Essence token is a 1/1 white creature token with flying. This is obviously very powerful for a number of reasons. One, white is a color that loves its tokens, as the recently printed Anointed Procession would tell you. That just makes this card even better than it already is. But just think about this. Whenever a non-token creature, granted, dies, you do one of the things that white loves to do most, make tokens. And not only are you doing that, but you're essentially replacing the creature that just died. You're probably replacing it with something weaker, but hey, it's still replacement. So if you get board wiped with this thing around, you're probably going to end up with a bunch of tokens as compensation when probably nobody else is, which is a pretty solid deal. Also notable is that the tokens you make have flying. So not only are your creatures dying and you're replacing them, but you're replacing them with creatures with evasion. That just makes it doubly powerful. And this is just a really nice piece of insurance, especially when you're playing a white deck, to make sure that if you walk into a board wipe, you're okay. If you play out your hand, your opponent tops you, and you need to board wipe, you won't lose as much as you possibly could have. Nice insurance policy, and overall, pretty solid card.
Pretty much hit the nail on the head, Kyle. But the one thing I really do like about this card the most is that the creatures have flying. They're evasive little tokens. So instead of them being on the ground and not being able to plow through, they can now poke through the air if they need to. But it also gives you another form of blocking if there's flyers and everything. Great card, very useful. Definitely going to give you an edge if you're ahead, and I love it. It's great. Now, moving on to my number 8, I also have a white card. We're looking at a creature named Marble Titan. It costs 4 mana, 3 generic, and a white, and it is a 3/3 giant. Creatures with power 3 or greater do not untap during their controller's untap phases. You may be thinking, alright, this guy's a 3/3, and he's making it so he doesn't untap. Why is that good? Well, the reason this is good is because when he enters, he's not tapped. He can still block. But if your opponent went through and attacked with a big guy earlier, he's not getting to untap with it. Kind of like the other Titan, if you remember Frost Titan, where it's the blue variant that makes it so that when it attacks or enters, something gets tapped down, doesn't untap. But this one makes it for a global effect. You don't have to target one thing in particular. It just makes it so if your opponent wants to use something big, they have one shot to do it, and they have to make it count. As long as this guy's from the field, you're always going to have to deal with this card first.
This card I like as well because it also deals with one of the cardinal problems that white has, which is white is a weenie color. It likes to play lots of little aggressive creatures that unfortunately end up getting outclassed over the course of the game when ramp decks, for example, play bigger, better creatures. Marble Titan resolves that problem quite nicely by keeping their really strong creatures potentially in check as long as A, they're not careful, and B, they don't feel like attacking with them. And also, that gives your little creatures that are most likely less than 3 power free reign to just swing in and smack them if they don't really pay attention. And there are lots of ways of getting around this ability temporarily. So, honestly, this is just a really solid card for a white deck, I think, in general. Well, speaking of power, there is certainly no shortage on it on our next card, my next card that is, although it is sort of a double-edged sword. Well, there might even be more edges than just double, but you'll see. It is number 7 on my list, and it's called Furnace of Wrath. Yet another enchantment. This one is red and it costs 4. 1 and triple red, so kind of a hefty color commitment there. And has a very simple effect. Double all damage assigned to any creature or any player. You probably can figure out pretty quickly that, as I said, this is kind of a dangerous card to play with, and you are literally playing with fire when you play this. This also doesn't go many places outside of a deck that is heavily invested in red, as the triple red requirement kind of indicates. And you really need a deck with a lot of damage effects and creatures and abilities in there to get the full value out of something like Furnace of Wrath. Otherwise, it is going to be much more of a liability than an asset for you. However, if you play this card in a very aggressive kind of red deck that is focused on taking somebody out, essentially, before they can take you out, you can really work with this card. And there are also a number of very, very interesting scenarios that this card kind of comes out with. I really like these double damage cards, and this was really the first one of its kind. There were ones after this, like Heartless Hitagetsu, Dictate of the Twin Gods. You take your pick. There are a lot of them out there. This was just the first one that really did this on a global scale. And keep in mind, it not only doubles damage to players, but also to creatures. So that 1/1 that's blocking a 2/2 suddenly gets to kill that 2/2. Just one of the many scenarios in which this card could potentially be helpful, but like Nature's Revolt earlier, you gotta be real careful when you're using this so it doesn't bite you.
You're on a roll, man, for complicated cards. Like, it reads easy, but it's just adding more and more levels of hair-ripping gameplay out for some players. But I really do love this card, Kyle. It makes it so that certain things that typically would be low impact are now very high impact. It makes it so that things play differently. So if you look at lands, for example, like you get a fetch land into a shock land. How much more damage did you just take right there? And if your opponent is using a pain land and they don't have the correct mana going on right there, they're taking double that amount of damage too. So it doesn't even have to be you're using just plain up burn spells. You're more or less, you're utilizing damage that would already be there. And that's really, really powerful. And plus, it only costs 4 mana, so this comes out early and it can stick around for a long time. Who would want to waste a removal spell on this? Like, it's going to help you get ahead as long as you play your cards right. Now, going from such flames into a color to quelch such flames, we're looking at a blue instant called Urtai's Meddling. It costs X and blue. Now, it reads, when target spell is successfully cast, put X delay counters on it. X can't be 0. During each upkeep of that spell's caster, remove a delay counter from that spell. If that spell has no delay counters on it, it resolves. So pretty much what this is saying is I'm not countering something. I'm making it so it'll come out later. It's delaying something to enter. And the reason why I like this so much is that there's certain cards that become useless if they become delayed, or it makes it so that you can get an advantage that it is delayed. The reason why that you would use this is if somebody goes ahead and tries to counter something that you are doing it, you can play this on that counter spell. And then it makes it so on the upkeep it resolves, and there's nothing there for it to counter, so it just fizzles and goes away, which is really powerful. But also we see other cards that can't be countered, such as Supreme Verdict. So if that's a card that can't be countered, well, you want to make it so that you can get the value you have right there out of your board state because you know it's coming in. And you can then choose when this resolves. So if you have a lot of mana and you're like, all right, well, let me just get one more round and I'll be fine, then, that's perfectly fine. All right, I'll pay 2 mana, we'll wait 1 turn, and then it comes into play. But you can also make it last indefinitely, which is really powerful because it works on commanders, works on sorceries, works on planeswalkers, it works on everything. And it's just a really cool card that you don't see a lot of, but it is really powerful, especially for that cost.
Yes, there is actually one card for comparison that is available out there. It's from the Time Spiral block, and it's called Delay. It's kind of an obvious reference to this card in that it costs 2 mana to basically counter something, and instead of hard countering it, delay it for always 3 turns. I kind of like Urtai's Meddling even a little bit better, though, because while if you cast them at the same mana cost, Urtai's Meddling would not be as good as just straight up Delay would be. I like the fact that this scales over the course of the game. I'm not usually a huge fan of scalable counter spells because I would much rather prefer something that was a set cost, hard counter something, and that's the end of it. But the beauty of Urtai's Meddling is it basically is a hard counter, and for all the reasons you said, Stu, if you get this up high enough, you could delay something so long that the game might be over and it won't matter anyway, or you could just strategically delay something a few turns until a point where you can either A, prepare for it more adequately, or B, it just won't be useful anymore. Well, I am going to turn from that to yet another card that may be sort of a double-edged sword, but in this case, I think it's really obvious that the benefits outweigh the negatives. It's yet another enchantment, and it's green this time, called Recycle. It costs 6, so 4 and double green, and it is an enchantment that reads, skip your draw phase. Whenever you cast a spell, draw a card, and during your discard phase, choose and discard all but 2 cards. There's some levels to this card that we need to talk about. First of all, skip your draw phase. That is a line of text that gives any player pause. That's horrible. Why would I ever skip my draw phase? That's like the only chance I get to draw cards. And especially if I'm a green deck, I really need all the card drawing I can get. I shouldn't skip out on that, That is conventional wisdom, and in a lot of cases that is true. Also, the fact that during your discard phase you have to discard all but 2 cards in your hand, that's something to think about as well. But let's focus on the positives. Whenever you cast a spell, draw a card, that is an insanely powerful ability. And the fact that especially in a deck that usually either is mono green or includes green, you're probably not going to have the best card advantage in the world a lot of the time. This kind of advantage is really something that you're not going to get anywhere else. You do have to give up your draw phase, that is true. But if you think about that, giving up 1 draw a turn for the potential of probably many multiple draws in the same turn, especially the later in the game this gets, this card can potentially be an advantage machine. I should also say that the discarding ability can help some decks. There are some decks that just want more cards in the graveyard quickly, and this is certainly a way to do that. All in all, I think this makes for a very interesting card. Again, certainly not something every deck would want, but I think the possible card advantage that this thing offers in a color that normally doesn't get a lot of it is just too good not to consider.
There's a lot going on with this card, and I agree with what you said here, Kyle. There's one main pro and con that I have for this card in particular. The biggest con being is, like, let's say you draw a whole bunch of cards, right, and you discard down to something. Let's say you only have 2 cards, right? You already did the discard, it's turn 2. You draw into a land. You play the next card. You draw into another land. You have nothing left to cast, and now you only have 2 lands in your hand. So now you're essentially screwed for as long as this thing's out in the field. But another thing that makes it as a pro is if you destroy this before the end phase comes up, you keep all those cards. Like, you don't have to discard down if you're under 7 cards. And green has a lot of forms of destroying artifacts and enchantments. So it's not exactly too hard to get some sort of low-cost card to destroy this enchantment, which is really a good pro for it. So like a dredge deck, for example, that loves green. It doesn't matter having stuff in the graveyard, and you can always get that stuff back into your hand. So in this case, it's like, alright, you wouldn't have to worry about having 2 lands in your hand and being dead. You have a way around it, which is good as a failsafe, and you can keep the deck going, which is really, really strong. So, interesting card, little niche, little scary, and a little powerful. So it's definitely something to make note of.
Well, speaking of scary, Stu, I think your next card has a monopoly on that.
Yeah, we have Tempest of Wrath. It costs 5 for an enchantment, being 3 colorless and double black, and it reads, whenever any creature is dealt damage, destroy it. The creature can't be regenerated this turn. That is exactly what this card reads. If anything is slightly pinged or hurt or bleeding, it is just dead. So you have to be real careful with who you're blocking with and who you are attacking with. And Kyle, looks like I'm taking a leaf out of your book because it is something that is definitely going to complicate a lot of plays. I love this card because it's powerful on its own. It really doesn't matter what deck it's in. It's really, really, really going to make an emphasis on the game once it enters the field. Now, that being said, there are decks, like I said, that when targeting, it matters. And there are a bunch of little cards out there that make it so when it targets something, something's going to happen. So this with like Staff of Nin, for example, is just something that's ridiculous. You're drawing extra cards, you're pinging something, and that is going to kill it every single time. So it's something that's a very strong combination. So it's almost like, if you think about it, like a pseudo kind of death touch, provided that you keep this on the field.
That's actually exactly what I was going to say, Stu, in that at the very, very floor level of understanding this card, 5 mana, all your creatures have Death Touch. And Death Touch that can't be stopped by regeneration, that's really good. Even if it does get given to all creatures, it puts everyone on kind of the same playing field in such that nobody really wants to attack with creatures because bad things will happen no matter what. I would play this card just if it were that, but there's more to it. In combination with red, especially, this is a really, really potent card, in that, think about cards like Scouring Sands, for example, where for 2 mana, you can do 1 damage to every creature on the battlefield. Not really that impactful all on its own, but combine it with a card like Death Pits of Wrath, and suddenly you have a 2 mana board wipe. That is certainly a possibility that you have to consider. And that is, again, just a very low level of the kind of chaos that this card can bring to the game. I really like this one. I'm glad it made your list, Stu, because it's definitely one of my favorites. Well, I guess we didn't really get away from the complication, because we're right back in it with that card and my next card, Duplicity. It's my number 5 on the list, and yes, yet another enchantment. This time it's blue. It also costs 5, 3, and double blue. Let's read this one. When Duplicity comes into play, put the top 5 cards of your deck face down on Duplicity. During your upkeep, you may exchange all the cards in your hand for the cards on Duplicity. At the end of your turn, you choose and discard a card, and if you lose control of Duplicity, put all cards on it into its owner's graveyard. Again, this is a really complicated card to try and understand at first brush, and there's really just a wall of text here. Let's look at the negatives first of all. At the end of your turn, you choose and discard a card. Not quite as bad as something like Recycle, but still, it does cost something every turn, and obviously, if you can't discard a card, this card is going to go away, as well as all the advantage you accumulated. But still, discarding a card at the end of every turn is really not all that bad of a downside, especially considering that this card's upside is you almost get an entirely different hand to play with. Using Duplicity is kind of like having 2 hands, really, and you can exchange your cards between them at any given time. Sure, at first you won't know what the 5 cards you got rid of were, but once you do this once, both hands are basically a known quantity, and you can pick which one you want to play with at any given time. I should also note that, given the fact that you have 2 hands like this, whatever hand is on Duplicity at the time is untouchable unless they were to get rid of duplicity itself. So if there's something you really want to keep and there are effects out there making you discard your hand every turn or something silly like that, you can always store things on duplicity to stop that from happening. Just a really kind of cool card and bringing about card advantage in blue in a really kind of unique way. The only card that I can really compare this to is Memory Jar, and I honestly think this might be an even better version of Memory Jar in some ways, because with Memory Jar, you only get one turn to play with the cards that you picked up, and everybody's getting the same advantage as you. With Duplicity, it's kind of a memory jar that almost sticks around in a lot of ways, and for that reason alone, I really like it.
Yeah, this is a card I've liked, and I've tried putting into a handful of decks, and for a lot of the reasons you've noted. It's a great card, being that it can preserve a hand. And like the new Locust God that just came out, where people want to create a lot of wheel effects, meaning that they are drawing a lot of cards and discarding a lot of cards, is really, really strong in that. But the problem with that kind of strategy is that when the Locust God dies, it goes back to your hand. But if you wheel, the God goes into discard, which means back into the command zone, meaning that you don't get around the cost. Now, a card like Duplicity then makes it so that you can put him onto the side and preserve him, and make it so that you can then come back to him and recast him and not have to worry about this whole crazy cycle thing. With Brago, he has the effect to make it so when you attack, you blink out whatever amount of permanence you want. If you do it to this, it makes it so that you can constantly fly through your deck and make it so you can find better answers or cultivate a better hand, which is really good. And like another card that is in Tempest, Scroll Rack is a really strong card in the fact that it makes it so you get a foresight of what is to come in the deck, and it makes it so you exchange your hand for that hand inherently. And that's what Duplicity is doing. Now, the price between those two we'll talk about later, but it's like another variety or another option that you could have that's a lot more budget for this. And again, this one's an enchantment. It can be utilized in a whole bunch of different ways. It's doing blue what blue likes to do at its core. Very fun card, very aggressive in the right context, but it's a great find, and I absolutely love it. Keeping things away from the complicated spectrum, because that seems to be all the cards we've talked about so far, I'm going to make my number 5 a lot simpler. And I'm going to do another color wheel on this one, because I can't just choose one. My number 5 is going to the Medallions. And now these are the cards that are 2-drop artifacts, and they just read very simply, reduce the cost of your spells by 1. And there's one for each color, so like Jet Medallions for black, you have the Ruby Medallion for red, Pearl for white, so it's almost like a slightly better signet. You are paying a 2-drop artifact to boost your mana by 1 with a signet. This one has the potential to boost it up by 2, 3, 4, all depends on how late it is in the game, because in this way it scales, and you can get more mana back into your pool and utilize it for more spells, which is really, really great.
Yes, I like these cards as well, Stu. I am going to say, while they are good, they don't necessarily belong in every deck. In a monocolor deck, I would slam dunk pick these for the inclusion every single time, because it just is crazy the amount of mana saving that you can get in a monocolor deck. For Pearl Medallion, for example, just take 1. Your white spells cost 1 less to play. That means every single white spell you play is going to cost 1 less. With a normal mana rock, you're only really going to reduce even the cost of a spell once, 1 spell for 1 turn. Pearl Medallion, or any of the medallions, does it for any of their chosen color every single time you play it. I would say, though, that as you add more colors to the deck, these medallions get less and less relevant, and the more and more I would just like a generic mana rock, like a Felwar Stone, or a Dark Steel Ingot, or a Signet even. But as I said, I think these cards, while they don't really belong in decks with more than 1 color, in decks with 1 color, they are an absolute staple, and you should run them.
I have to disagree with you on this, Kyle, just for the fact that you could run it in a dual color deck if your color pie is totally slanted on one side. So like, for example, if you're white and black, and for example, like you're running 2/3 of the deck as white, a Pearl Medallion wouldn't exactly hurt in this case. Like, you might want to run the Signet for that color, and also run the Pearl, for example, if you need more ramp. So they could be a little bit more of a variety beyond just monocolor decks, and again, depending on your playstyle that you're running. But very strong card, very simple, so if you guys are getting a little overwhelmed, hopefully we got you refreshed on that.
Well, moving on from monocolor themed sort of things, at least in my opinion, to a multicolored card, and what kind of reviewer would I be if I didn't pick at least one legendary creature for my top 10? So in this slot, for my number 4, we have Vaatiill Doll. He is a 4 mana creature, 2, a green, and a black. He is a 3/3 as well, and he has a very simple ability, which is tap, target creature's power or toughness is 1 until the end of the turn. You do have to choose either power or toughness. It does not actually make it so that the creature is straight up just a 1/1. That may add a little bit of complication to this card, but it also adds a lot more favorable elements as well. For example, just think of somebody having a giant 20/20 creature on the field. You attack them with your 1/1 that doesn't really do anything. In 99.9% of the situations, they would just chump block your guy, nothing would happen, and that would be the end of it. It would have been a dumb move on your part. But if Vaatiill Doll was in play, you can tap him, and suddenly their 20/20 becomes a 21. And then if they block, it's going to be a problem for them. The same if somebody attacks. They attack with a giant creature, you can suddenly make their power or toughness really, really small. In some cases, sure, even getting any damage through it all is still going to hurt you, but a lot of the time, if you just make a really powerful creature a lot smaller, and even in a multiplayer political setting, this card can really make some people nuts, because if you take something's toughness especially down to 1, there are plenty of ping effects, especially in these colors, that can take them down super easily. I like Vaatiill Doll. I've kind of thought of him as maybe a commander possibility, just because tap abilities are so useful, but I like him. I think he's very unique for a commander possibility.
I do like it how it can be power or toughness, because if they're coming in with some sort of big, I don't know, blight steal, for example, he's no longer an 11/11, he's now a 1/11 or an 11/1. I don't know why you would do that, but for example, you can make it so that you can manipulate certain kind of effects which are key in like the realms of like poison or infect. But if you're running black, there's another card I like a little bit more than this. It's called Sorceress Queen. Old card, crazy old, where it pretty much just it taps and makes target creature a 0/2 until the end of the turn. Like we see different kinds of effects that are similar to this guy, where you can then go ahead and make it so that you can morph something. So like turn to frogs or rapid hybridization, in which that all right, you are now manipulating the creature to change the power and toughness on it. So those kind of combat tricks are very strong and very powerful. Now moving on to my number 4, I'm going to use a card that's going to make you guys want to check the Oracle text, because I had to do it, and I think I'm reading this the right way. It's a card called Maddening Imp. It costs 3 mana, it's 2 generic and a black, and it's a 1/1 flyer. So, not exactly the ideal stats for a creature, but this effect is the thing that is really crazy. So, just for a regular tap, all non-wall creatures target opponent controls attack this turn if able. At end of the turn, destroy each of those creatures that did not attack. Use this ability during target opponent's turn and only before combat. What this is doing is a one-sided board wipe, which makes it so that, alright, if you aren't attacking, it's dead. And usually for these kind of effects, they usually cost a lot of mana. Like in Garrick's Wake is like a one-sided board wipe, in which that you're like, alright, I'm destroying your stuff and my stuff is fine. And I mean, this thing does have a little bit of timing on it, so it has to be like, alright, it has to stay on the field for a turn and last, and it has to be during one player's turn before their combat. But one of the things here that is really, really key is that this card reads, if able. This gets around summoning sickness, if I'm correct. So it makes it so if a creature does not have haste, it will die. So that now whatever is on your opponent's side of the field will just be dead. Now, there are different things that, can get around this if you have Lightning Greaves, or if you have Hammer Perforos or something else along these lines to make it that way. But it's just so oppressive that you could repeatedly board wipe the field with just a simple tap effect. It's a 3 mana flyer who can just constantly bombard your opponent, and that blows my mind.
Well, you are absolutely right, Stu. If a creature does not have haste and its owner gets targeted with Maddening Imp, it is just going to die. Now, back in the beginning when I was talking about Magnetic Web and other similar cards in the set, this is one of the ones that I was talking about, and I don't really have too much to add here, Stu, because I think the power is really pretty obvious on this card. I think In some cases, it might be a little more fragile than something like Magnetic Web because it's a creature and therefore much more susceptible to being destroyed in a variety of ways. But the effect certainly scales with that and is much more potentially powerful and immediately useful. I would really hate to be on the other side of the table from this card if things were set up the right way, and as you said, it can be quite maddening.
But also, quick fun fact, this is black, and it's a creature. What does black love to bring back? Creatures. So if your opponent does kill this, it can come back, and they're going to constantly keep moaning and groaning when this thing enters the field. It has to be exiled, otherwise there is no true answer for this. Like, it's just going to come back, it's just going to blow up the field, and for 3 mana, play this early. They're not going to get a field after that. They'll just have to have enchantments and artifacts. Like, it's just so strong. And I believe this card's like 20 cents. Like, what deck would not want to have a 20-cent recurable board wipe every turn? It's ridiculous.
I think we should also note that aside from just the destruction alone, these kind of provoke effects are generally pretty cool in that you can set things up such that you force your opponent to attack, they're open, you can then swing at them with everything you've got the following turn, or you can make them attack into your strategically placed death touch creatures, for example, and manipulate things to work in your favor to kill off the opposing attacking army, or at least render it irrelevant. And that's just yet another angle of things that you could use with this card. Black doesn't really get a whole lot of this anymore, so this is just one of those things that can help you certainly turn things to your advantage. Well, speaking of bringing things back as well, that's what my next card does very, very well. Number 3 on my list for Tempest is Coffin Queen. This is a 3-mana creature, also a 1/1, does not have flying this time, but is a wizard, so very relevant creature type there. She costs 2 colorless and 1 black. You can choose not to untap Coffin Queen during your untap step. Why would you want to do that, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. You can tap 3, again, 2 colorless and a black, and tap her to put target creature from any graveyard into play under your control. You then exile that creature if either Coffin Queen becomes untapped or if you lose control of Coffin Queen. The closest card that I can compare this to is something like Apprentice Necromancer, for example. I know there are a lot of cards out there like Whip of Erebos or something that bring cards back for 1 turn and then get rid of them. Coffin Queen is notable in that it brings the creature back more or less permanently as long as you can protect Coffin Queen. But the fact that if this card is not answered directly, Coffin Queen is just going to sit there and keep generating value over the course of the game is very powerful. Also note that unlike cards like Apprentice Necromancer and Whip of Erebos, you can take other people's creatures that are probably, maybe, better than yours, and not just your own. So if anything dies, people are going to have to watch out if Coffin Queen's in play.
I would love to see this card in like a chainer deck where it's like constantly fueling its field from the graveyard. And I think it's actually very similar to chainer in the fact where it's like, if this card leaves the field, then it's exiled. So it makes it so that stuff is kind of like a one-time shot for all graves. And that's very powerful because a lot of decks, like we've said before, love to draw its fuel and its fire from the graveyard. So being able to permanently remove those options is very, very strong. But also growing your field with it, crazy powerful as well. I love this card, and especially with the new wizard deck that we've seen in the Commanders set, I would love to see how this card works in there. It definitely has its day in the sunlight, and that day is now. So I'd love to see some builds on this. Now, moving from one black card to another, and I assure you this is my last one, I have an enchantment for you guys. It is called Dorothy Embrace. It's another 3-drop, 2 generic and a black, and like I said, it's an enchantment. For double black, target creature gains shadow until the end of turn. Now, we haven't talked about shadow much yet, but in Tempest, there are a lot of creatures that have shadow effects, meaning that it's kind of like flying, or it's a worded text effect that it can only be tied to another creature with it. So like for example, if you have a flyer, the only creature that can block it is a flyer or a card with reach that has that. Shadow is the same way. It can only block creatures with shadow, and it can't be blocked by anything else. So it's very strong in that effect, because it pretty much makes something inherently unblockable. So for 2 mana, making it so that something can swing in and swing in hard is really, really good. Now, a lot of decks will run Whispersilk Cloak, and now that's a great equipment for an obvious reason. It makes it so that something can go in and attack. And like we said before with Rogue's Passage, it does the same thing. Target creature goes in and it attacks, but only for a low cost of 2 mana, and it's, again, recurable. This isn't a one-time use per turn. You can make your entire army grow into a form of unblockable. So you can swing in big, you can swing in fast, and you can swing in loud. And this also works on other people's creatures. So there's some sort of effect like a Steel Hellkite's on the field, Master of Cruelties, or a Blightsteel. Tap 2, they're going to attack in, and your other opponent is going to have to deal with it. It's really good, really strong, and a huge political tool.
This is one of those cards that actually gets better from the fact that it's older. Shadow cards really didn't exist outside of Tempest, except for a small handful of things that came up over the years, mostly in Time Spiral when they brought Shadow back a little tiny bit. But this benefits from that because in blue, we usually see things that give other things unblockability. We don't really see a ton of that in black, although there are a few examples. Shadow did appear on a lot of different cards, but mostly on black cards. And the fact that Shadow was never really reprinted in any serious way basically makes this card read, tap 2 black, target creature is unblockable. In a black deck, where a lot of creatures get beneficial abilities, as you were saying, Stu, Master of Cruelties being one that automatically leaps to mind, that just work when they hit other players, and you have to make sure they hit other players, Douthie Embrace does so for very little investment. Perhaps not as good as a card like Whispersilk Cloak, for example, but in some ways actually a lot easier to use, and I like it for that. Well, going from that to another card that is relatively simple in comparison to things we've been talking about, we have number 2 on my list, Altar of Dementia. Now, this is an artifact that can be used in any deck for a measly 2 mana. And again, pretty straightforward effect. You sacrifice a creature, and target player puts a number of cards equal to that creature's power from the top of their deck into their graveyard. This is quite clearly a mill card, and it's meant for milling people, although mill other people or mill yourself, you could do either, and you could really have good cause to do either of those things. A lot of decks that use this card enjoy not only milling other people, but also milling themselves. One that pops right into my mind is a deck like Sidisi, for example, or a deck that focuses on milling other people in combination with cards like Undead Alchemist. Let's think about that combo. As long as the Alchemist is on the field, they mill any number of cards, you make more zombies. So it kind of provides an almost sort of infinite loop, given the fact that this is a free sack outlet. I think the thing that really puts Altar of Dementia over the top is that it is a free sack outlet. Otherwise, it wouldn't be nearly as powerful as it is. And as such, this fuels a lot of broken combos that require free sack outlets. But on one hand, you have a card like Viscera Seer, where, free sack outlet, you scry 1. That's pretty cool, but is it going to win you the game? Not immediately. Altar of Dementia, on the other hand, could win you the game almost immediately, given the right conditions, by milling somebody out. That makes it worth considering on that alone.
Yeah, Kyle, sacrificing is really, really strong, especially when there is no cost tied to it. Like, we see cards like Greater Good or Martyr's Bond, for example, in which, if you can sacrifice something for free at instant speed, you get a lot of value out of it. So it makes it so if somebody goes and board wipes you or returns stuff to your hand, you can get the value you want right then and now. And I know for a fact, Kyle, you actually have a Geist of St. Traff deck right now, and that is a great commander for the fact that it can constantly keep generating the field. The downside to the token that it produces is it leaves at the end of the step. If you put something like Altar of Dementia in that deck, hypothetically, you can then get additional value from that token. So instead of having it leave the field due to its own effect, you can then use something like Altar of Dementia, so you can then pop the creature and make it so any opponent can mill 4 cards, which is really, really powerful. So now moving on to my number 2, and I'm not going to be talking about black again, but it's a white enchantment called Hannah's Custody. And it's very simple in the fact that it reads very simply: artifacts can't be the target of spells or abilities. Now, you've heard us in our previous segments before about cards like Fountain Watch or Padim, the ability to make it so that artifacts can't be targeted. And that's really, really powerful because a lot of artifacts are very, very powerful. And a lot of artifacts can really heighten the level of a deck's support. So if you look at it, Birthing Pod's a strong artifact. Altar of Dementia is a strong artifact. Scroll Rack is a very strong artifact. Being able to make it so not only artifacts, but even artifact creatures can't be targeted by stuff is super, super strong. And this is an enchantment. It isn't even an artifact. So if they play something like Destroy Target Artifact, it doesn't work on this thing. So it's kind of going across the board. In fact, that an enchantment is helping an artifact. So this way you can kind of build a different form of protection on it, which is very interesting. And I like this card just for it's a very simple dynamic, but it's very powerful in that.
Yeah, this card is almost greater Aromancy just for artifacts, and that makes it pretty powerful on its own. Although I would note, Stu, that in a lot of cases, I know I say that non-creatures are actually more powerful than creatures because they're less susceptible to traditional removal. I think there are other cards, and even aside from the obvious comparison to something like Fountain Watch, which protects artifacts and enchantments, I think Leona Nabunas is possibly the superior version of this card because it may be a creature and it may be slightly more expensive, but it has nice defensive stats, and also it gives your artifacts hexproof rather than shroud, as this card does, because this means you can't target your artifacts with your own spells, whereas with Leona Nabunas, you might be able to. Very small technicality, I know, but that kind of makes that card that came later a little bit superior to this one for me, but certainly I know you'll enjoy these cards, and I agree. It is a pretty powerful effect to give blanket cards of one type the ability to not be targeted. Certainly very useful, and this might be a pretty good budget option for a lot of people.
Well, also one thing to remember is that sacrificing doesn't cause something to target. So for example, if you're using like Brea, for example, and you want to sacrifice something, it will still get around that. And also if the artifact is in the graveyard, it's absolved from this effect as well, so that you can still then go ahead and recur it. So while it's on the field, yes, Shroud could maybe mess you up if you want to go in ahead and equip like an artifact onto a different creature, for example, you would no longer be able to. But making it so that you can't be targeted with stuff is always powerful. So I like this card a lot. There are other ones out there, but I mean, why would you want one? Let's get multiples of these effects.
Well, you're not wrong. Speaking of multiples and speaking of general destruction and protection, I'm going to move from protection in this card to the number one card on my list, which brings only destruction, but it's the best kind of destruction because it's one-sided and I love it so much. When we started reviewing Tempest and I realized that this was where the card was first printed, there was really no chance that the number one on my list was going to be anything else. So topping my list is Living Death. This is a 5-mana sorcery. It is black. It costs 3 and double black. And it has a somewhat complex ability. Takes a minute to figure out, but you'll very quickly realize how good it is. You play it, you first set aside all creatures in all graveyards. Then you put each creature that is in play into its owner's graveyard, and then put each creature card that's been set aside from the graveyards originally into play. Put simply, this card basically replaces all the creatures on the field with the cards in all the players' graveyards. And to errata this card a bit as it has been since then, the cards from your graveyard are exiled and then they're put into play. The creatures that are already in play are sacrificed. They are not destroyed, they are sacrificed. This actually gets around a lot of things like powerful indestructible abilities and triggers a lot of things such as, sacrifice and death triggers that can really be pretty beneficial for you. I love this card because as long as you play it in the right deck, you will always be on the winning end of this thing, as long as you play your cards right. The deck that I play this in is Sidisi, for obvious reasons. A mill deck that self-mills all of its good creatures into the graveyard much more quickly than anyone else is building their own graveyards. You then play Living Death, you suddenly get a massive flow of creatures from where there probably wasn't a whole lot before. Your opponents, who really haven't been milling themselves at all, lose all their creatures. Maybe they get one or two back, but you are in the far superior position. Living Death is a board wipe that requires a little bit more strategy than a lot of them to pull off and do well. But when you do, it feels oh so good, and this card just is straight up amazing.
I wouldn't necessarily categorize this as a board wipe beyond like a board reset in a sense, because I mean the whole goal of this isn't necessarily to remove all creatures from the field, it's to replace them. So the fact that if somebody doesn't have any creatures in the grave, they lose everything and get nothing. That is powerful. But again, you're using black. That's mill, that's discard, that's dredge. There's so much stuff that black loves to do with the graveyard. Its love with the grave is like unparalleled to anything else in the game. This card is pure flavor of black. It makes it so this can be a win con for you if you do it at the right time or if the right deck is in play. Pure headache, I'll tell you that much, but it's a phenomenal card and it definitely warrants a #1 spot. But for my #1 spot, I couldn't give it to that. I had to go for something a little bit more different, and it's a card that it's just tricky, it's just fun, and it does actually kind of go well with a black strategy. It's called Helm of Possession. It is a 4-drop artifact, and like some of the cards we said before, you can then choose not to untap this card. And the reason you would do that is for 2 mana, you can go ahead and you can tap it. You then sacrifice a creature and gain control of target creature as long as this card remains tapped. So let's think about this for a second. You're gaining control of a creature for the cost of another creature. Now, that might initially set you back on this, but there's tons of creatures that can be easily recurable from the graveyard due to their own effect or due to that color's synergies. So if you look at something like Bloodghast, for example, he comes back just from the simple effect of playing a land. So losing him is no skin off your nose, for example. But there's also other really good cards to put in the grave. So if you look at a card called Wonder, for example, it's mainly noted for being in the graveyard because it gives you such great, powerful abilities. So the fact that this card is colorless makes it so that any deck can use it. And any deck should use this as long as you're using creatures. Because at a very simple, low cost, you grab control of another creature. Mainly somebody's commander. And this is instant speed, too. So it makes it so no matter what they do, they have to deal with this first before their plan can move forward. And that is very, very strong.
I have to be honest, Stu, this card might have made it, probably not to the top, but near the top of my list, but I missed it in my overview of Tempest, and I can't believe it, because this is a card that I have played with many a time, and never really been disappointed with. It's powerful for all the reasons you said it is, but you have to go the extra mile, I think, to make this card as broken as it can be. For example, a commander deck featuring the likes of Brian Stoutarm as your commander, or featuring one of the many steal other people's creatures effects that are available in Magic. Yasova Dragonclaw, Zealous Conscript, Mass Mutiny, or Insurrection, just to name a few. Think of something like this, a situation where you use one of said cards to steal an opponent's creature. You then use Helm of Possession, sacrifice the creature you took from them to take yet another one of their creatures. Let's say you hypothetically have something like an Altar of Dementia out, for example, like we just talked about. You can then proceed to, when you're done with it, or when you're just tired of it and don't need it anymore, or they're going to take it back, or something like that, just sacrifice their creature again for more profit, and the vicious cycle continues. And this card is vicious. Almost any deck can really benefit from an effect like this, really, and the fact that it steals creatures so readily and is colorless and can go in any deck, definitely a plus.
Usually blue has a lot of like the gain control of target creature effects, like you see with Hypnotic Siren, Mind Control, or Corrupt Conscience. Being able to get this effect across the board in any color is really, really powerful because, you know, when this comes out in a deck that typically doesn't do this effect, you are now surprising your opponents, they don't really know how to counteract this strategy, and it gives you an advantage. And like we've been saying with all these cards, they give you some form of advantage, and it makes it in a very sneaky way so that your opponents aren't going to be prepared for it. And that's really the key.
Well, unfortunately, that's our pool time today, but if the water felt just right for you, be sure to check out our next video where we talk about the top 10 money cards of Tempest.
So those are the toys we were playing with today. If you think we missed any, be sure to let us know your favorite ones down in the comments below. And if that's not your style, be sure to tweet it at us at mtgthecardpool or email us at mtgthecardpool@gmail.com. I'm Stu Galetta.
And I'm Kyle Robertson, and we'll see you next time at the Card Pool.